Hello. So in Career Conversations, I've always had the pleasure of having young, dynamic professionals as well as, let's say, the CXOs of the world. So today I have Ankit Dhanuka. Why I brought him on the show was his unique path in the M&A zone. So a lot of us have interest about what about chartered accountants landing up in mergers and acquisitions. So Ankit is someone who has worked like in articleship in PwC, then subsequently worked in transaction advisory in EY, then Tata Steel M&A, and now Mahindra and Mahindra M&A. So he's going to give you some solid advice on M&A. So welcome to the show, Ankit. We really hope to learn a lot from you.
Thanks, Anurag. Thanks for having me here. It's really a privilege to kind of be part of this show. I was kind of looking forward to as to when I get a chance where you invite me and share some of my experiences. And we go a long way back in family, friends, and also get to be. It's great to be here, and I look forward to share some of my experiences, which I believe will benefit the wide audience which you have.
Yeah, cool. So my first question to you is, you are a Kolkata Marwadi chartered accountant. And so tell us one thing about your formative years in Howrah. We stay in the same town. That really shaped you as an individual. So were you always amongst those front benchers, the studious ones, the blue-eyed guys of the teachers in school and college? So let's start with this.
Right. So I'll answer that question possibly in two parts. One on the lighter note and then a little bit on the serious note. So Kolkata Marwadi CA Kol Madus, as we are very famously or infamously recognized as across India and in many cities, we kind of are recognized as a different class, I would say. And there are two good reasons for it. One is, so many people have come across really believe that the breed of CAs which come out from Kolkata are really hardworking, and you can really bank on them that they will, give in all in their heart in the work and deliver as to what they're expected to. And secondly, they are known as a very, very miser community and who would possibly won't indulge in too much of luxuries of life. So that's the kind, Kol Madus CAs are being classified as. But that's on the lighter note side. On the serious note, the question about my formative years. As you know, I come from the same background of parent. My father was also into a job, and I did not have a business background, so was brought up in a very humble background, wherein together with education and studies, a lot of focus was also given to the value system in which you are brought up. So there were a lot of I would say values around like honesty, integrity, discipline. All those things were imbibed quite early in life, which you are expected to carry forward in whatever you do. And I believe it really helps someone throughout his life. So I am an individual who are really driven by those very basic value systems which was imbibed into me by my parents, and I still find it very, very difficult to kind of compromise on those, because being in the corporate life, you would understand that there are a lot of situations which you possibly face wherein you are expected to kind of compromise on some of this.
Yeah.
But yes, if you have to, I as an individual is someone who's really very strongly driven by such core value systems.
And Srijan Vidyalaya teachers, Xavier's professors would look at you as a front bencher, or the guy who was like?
Yeah, I was the studious kind. Always kind of on the top 3, top 4 performers at school level and till my college levels. That did help in a lot of aspects of career planning, career growth, but it has its own pros and cons.
Okay, so all you 3 brothers, Saurav, who works with Wipro, you work with M&M, and Shivam works now with Pidilite, earlier was with Lupin, and so all of you are chartered accountants. So there is so much of homogeneity. What drew all of you into that same course? Didn't you think of variety in life?
So I am actually an accidental chartered accountant, and I'll give you the anecdote behind it. And I think there were a couple of similar instances shared by others also on your show. Uh, since I was the studious kind and kind of always uh, in the top ranks, those were the times wherein science was the in thing, and every top performer would want to go into the field of science, and commerce was more of a fallback options for people who could not get into science. So I was also driven by the same charisma, I would say, towards science, without really giving too much of thought as to whether I would really want to go into science, whether I have the capability to kind of cope up with what is required for getting into science and clearing those competitive exams. Immediately after my 10th, I went ahead and enrolled for tuition to start preparing for IITs and JEEs. Very determined that I will join science after the results are out. But somewhere in my household, in my family, there is not even a single example of someone who would have taken science. So my father was always very skeptical, and my elder brother, who was already into chartered accountancy course by then, was also not very sure whether that would be a field, because it was a completely unexplored field for someone in the family, and there was always a fear of failure which was there, and for that matter, commerce was always considered as a more secured, balanced career option. So after the 10th results were announced, I was few marks short in the science subjects and had to take up commerce. So much so that I went ahead and got my papers reviewed, and subsequently my marks increased to kind of cross the cutoff levels. But by then the train had left the station, so I stuck with commerce. And when I look back, I realized that possibly that was the right thing which happened. That's where destiny wanted me to be there, because I've seen a lot of my friends, a lot of good friends, studious friends, I would say, who landed up in science, but they really struggled to kind of, find their feet in the competitive exams. And I do realize that possibly I also was not the material for science. So I thought whatever happened for good.
I can completely agree, because driven by that same thing, I took up science, studied there for 2 years, qualified in entrance exams, but knew that since there is no one to act as a backup in case something goes wrong, then I shifted to commerce. That becomes quite a tricky thing. We had like Devang Toshniwal earlier, who also had gone to Kota, but then came back and then joined commerce. So there's obviously a lot of serendipity here. Now you joined PwC Stat Audit. And that is something which is like a big four articleship, like a very storied thing in the CA world. So is it really worth it, Ankit, like with the studies? Do you really think that it's worth taking that pressure? Does it help you in placements after CA? What if someone has missed the bus? Look, articleship is something which has got a lot of questions that come in the mind of a youngster.
So again, Big Four articleship, I would put it, has seen its phases of importance. When I had joined PwC as an article, that was the first year when the number of articles a CA could undertake under him was increased from, I think, 2 or 3 to 10, right? So before our batch, PwC used to take only 2 or 3 articles every year. And when I had joined, it had taken 50 articles in one batch, right? So till the time I joined, it was always a dream to get through any of the Big Fours for articleship, because they used to invite only the rank holders, and they used to really interview them and take only the rank holders in the articleship training. And that was really a big thing, and possibly a dream for every CA who take that course, who look forward to get into articleship in the Big Four. When I had joined PwC, I had a rank in Enter, and basis that I was invited for the interview, and the interview etc. went well, and I got through it. But I saw there were like 50 other candidates, and most of them, most of them I would say were through, client references or various other influences that would have happened, because there was a shortlisting criteria, but because of whatever reasons, because they had to fill in 50 seats, various kind of filters were applied. So over the period, I've realized that, the importance which it carried has kind of diluted a bit. Having said that, it is still worth it. I would personally believe that whatever I learned from, being from my articleship in PwC still helps me a lot, because there are 2-3 reasons to it. One is you get into that complete corporate environment very early in your life. I joined PwC when I was like 20, just still in my college. From college, we used to go for articleship. So for a 20-year-old, getting the feel of that entire corporate environment gives you really an insight as to how the future would be looking like, and then you can start planning and thinking about what do you really want to do in future. There were a lot of people who kind of realized that this kind of work environment is something which is not their cup of tea, and they really made up their mind that they would possibly want to go into business. Someone like me would identify my career choice very early, that possibly M&A is this space I would like to explore more. Others could identify audit or taxation as their own career choice. So it had that edge. Secondly, one of the things which generally a CA course lacked, and they have still not been able to fill up that gap, was on the overall soft skills and personality development and grooming part of it. So someone who's not very outgoing early in his life, a 3-year stint with a firm like PwC or another Big Four really helps you, where you are in client-facing situations throughout through your day, every time, and you are working directly with others. And there would be formal trainings every now and then where you would be where you will be undertaking various soft skill trainings, which becomes very important early in your life, and it really helps you groom into a professional. So I would say it did give an edge, and maybe up to an extent early in your career, wherein you are going for your campus placements, or as a fresher to a company for interview, if there are 5 people in the room of which you are the only Big Four, obviously you will have some bit of an edge over them. You will get a priority of interview possibly over the rest 4, but then ultimately it boils down to your own skills, your own talent. There, I believe it doesn't make too much of a difference.
All right. So then you joined EY Transaction Advisory Services. That was a dream profile. Normally, like, people think that it is investment banking, but I think that is slightly different. We'll look at it in the next question. So how did TAS in EY happen? So is there some criteria, like you have to be first attempt only, you need to have a Big Four articleship only? Tell us quickly about that as well.
There is no hard and fast rule about the number of attempts. Number of attempts is, again, I think, kind of a myth which has been created by a lot of other corporates, where they really filter on the basis of attempts you have taken to clear the exams. Talk about me, I had a rank in Enter, but I took 2 attempts to clear my final. So it really did not matter in getting through EY TAS. The basic requirement is you need to have a strong audit background, and definitely some bit of Big Four background. While there are exceptions, when people have gotten into transaction diligence, financial diligence to be due diligence to be very precise, without a Big Four experience, but those will be very few number of people. So even if you have not done your articleship from a Big Four, but if you have a decent audit background from during your articleship, and say a year and a half stint later on after qualification with a Big Four, you will be able to get through EY TAS, of course, subject to the test and interview checks which they apply.
All right. So how is it different from management consulting or investment banking? Because a lot of people tend to kind of confuse between a McKinsey, Bain, BCG, or a Bank of America investment banking with TAS. So what's the typical assignment? So what are the typical assignments that you have? Do you get also exposure to valuation? Are work hours long? A lot of questions around this.
So there are too many questions. Let's possibly go in parts.
Yeah.
So first question, whether it is different or similar to management consulting, it's very, very different. And it also depends on the kind of stream in due diligence you have opted for. So there could be a business diligence aspect, there could be a financial diligence aspect, there could be tax due diligence aspect, a technical diligence aspect, so hence, and a lot of others. A chartered accountant usually practices in two fields, financial diligence and tax diligence. Now, if you have opted for financial diligence, the key thing which you will be doing is basically, looking at the historical financials, analyzing them in much more detail to identify trends, and benchmarking them against the prevailing industry standards, industry practices, and recommending to your client whether those are solid enough to go ahead with the transaction or not. That's a one-liner brief of what you would be doing in a financial due diligence. While in management consultancy, that's not the case. In management consultancy, you would be working very, very closely with the company management itself to kind of identify various commercial and business aspects where you feel there are gaps, and you will advise the management of the company how to go about it for the overall growth or betterment of the company. So the whole objective of two things are very different. When you're doing a diligence from a buyer's perspective, you are actually approaching a third, a company wherein you have nothing to do with, you have no interest attached to that company. You're working precisely for your client to advise them in the best interest as to what's really going on in that company and whether it's really worth buying that company. Management consultants don't advise you on that aspect. They will advise you how's the health of the company, what could be done to kind of improve the health of the company, and how to really go about scaling up. So they will not identify synergy areas between one company and the acquiring company, right? That's something which possibly a business due diligence guy would do for you, or your own internal business people will kind of, through their experience in the market, identify what are the probable targets where you can really generate synergies from which companies, and you identify those targets. So that's getting into the M&A. Management consultancy will again help you with identifying certain goals of growing a company from an organic and inorganic perspective, but they will really not go and advise you on a particular company.
Do you do valuation as well? As in, do you prepare financial models also in transaction advisory?
So transaction advisory, again, in most of the big four are divided into three subdivisions. There would be a separate expert team on valuations, and then there would be team on taxation diligence, there would be team on financial diligence. If you are part of financial diligence, you won't be expected to run a full-fledged financial model and do a valuation, because then it becomes a conflicting assignment, because someone who is doing the diligence also is also running the valuation, and valuation being more of an art, as you know, there is a part of the conflict of interest. But in your financial diligence assignments, you are expected to have a good understanding of how valuations are done, because then it's on those parameters you would be advising your client that how's the profitability trend, how's the cash flow, how's the working capital cycle, so that the client can appropriately factor it in their financial models. So I would say, while you will really not be building the models, but you really need to have good understanding of the KPIs of every company you are diligencing to.
It's going to be a deep dive into the acquired companies' financials and operational performance. So that will be a lot of interesting work also, right?
And assumptions which your client would have kind of taken to build up the valuation, because you would have your discussion with the client as to what are the kind of assumptions you are taking into valuing this company, and then you will go and test those assumptions against the historical performance of the particular company.
So would you come across incidents like bogus sales or circuitous sales and all those things?
Several times. I still remember I was auditing a company based out of Chennai, and the entire purchase register and sales register were, I would say, inflated, so much so that they had gone ahead and prepared bogus invoices and filed into their books. So and this was an assignment for a private equity guy, and you know how a private equity guy works. For them, the revenue growth and profitability growth is the most important thing. And when we went ahead and advised, look, 50% of the sales is just does not exist, the assignment was called up within a week or so.
Oh my God, that is quite exciting.
Yeah. So the interesting part of for someone who would be looking for a career in this field in financial diligence is like you kind of pick up from where you would have left during your audit days, right? I always kind of summarize it that financial due diligence starts where audit ends. While a lot of people feel like it is still very much like audit, I have a very big point of view against that theory. While you will to a certain extent do tests and checks which are similar to audit, but at some point in time you will just take the numbers from audited financial statements as given, right? You are not going to question those whether those audited numbers are correct or not, and then you start applying great analytical tools to those numbers. Analytical review as part of audit one is expected to do, but in Indian audit scenarios those are to a very limited extent. But when you are looking at the same numbers from a financial due diligence point of view, you will go to kind of monthly, quarterly or weekly analysis of those numbers and bring out the hidden aspects of how really the business is run and whether those numbers really when benchmarked against the industry standards make sense or not. And it's on those aspects you advise your clients, right? So it's a great tool for learning about the nuances of the business a particular company is operating. You need to do a lot of research about the particular industry in which a particular target is working, so that you are able to bring out those aspects and advise your client. A client who is looking to acquire a company will simply not acquire based on their audited books, right? They would want you to give them and bring out facts which are not there in the audited books. And for that, you really need to kind of analyze the numbers to whatever levels you can. And that's where it is really different from what you've been used to do in audit. In audit, the objective is only to test the accuracy of a particular number. Here, the objective is much beyond than testing the mere accuracy of that.
Someone is putting his hard-earned money on the basis of these numbers. They are buying into this company.
Okay. Exactly.
So this kind of fantastic analysis that we have, does it also come at a cost of long hours, sleepless nights? Do you travel a lot, or is this data more given in like virtual data room, VDR?
Right. So these things are evolving, over time. When I had joined EY, and that was way back in the year 2010 when I started as a freshly qualified chartered accountant in the financial due diligence team. The scenario was there were not too many of electronic data rooms which were set up, and everyone wanted the consultants to be in their office working on the files. The files would be given to you over a pen drive or a CD or a desktop, which will be set up in a data room at the target's office or the client's office. So yes, there have been situations where we have traveled on like 5 hours, 6 hours notices. You were told in the morning that evening you have to go to a particular location, just pack your bags, go. We face situations like that. Before I joined, in fact, my seniors used to tell me that they have seen situations and wherein they used to carry a Jet Airways ticket booklet always with them. That used to allow them to fly anywhere in the company. So they would used to get a call, straight away go to airport, present that booklet of tickets, and just fly to whatever location they were told to. But those situations have changed over time. Electronic data rooms have gained much more importance. Plus, acquisitions and divestments of the companies are a really sensitive area, and no one wants to create too much of noise inside their doors about these things. So if you have too many consultants visiting, everyone starts getting a sense, as to what's going on. So people want to avoid those situations. And with the evolvement of technology, the electronic data rooms are mostly preferred way of diligence nowadays. You will be possibly working 3-4 weeks through electronic mediums, and then visit the client for a day or two to get clarifications, to present the findings, and henceforth. So that's how at least the travel bit has evolved. And given the COVID scenario, I don't think anyone is traveling anymore. there have been instances where the entire diligence has been completed electronically without giving any physical visit to the target office of the client. So that's at least the travel bit has evolved. It has its own pros and cons. While you avoid a lot of time in traveling, and you don't go to you're not sitting for 4 weeks or 5 weeks away from your home and family. Well, that's a good part of it, but the negative part of it possibly that feeler which you get while being at the office of a target company, and the soft aspects which you can pick up in the diligence as to how client is answering your questions, whether they're confident enough in what they're saying or not. Those aspects you miss, right? So it has its own pros and cons, but yes, that bit has evolved. So that takes care of your question on the travel bit. As far as working hours are concerned, again, I don't think there is any job where you don't need to put in that extra bit of hours to kind of really differentiate from what others are doing, right? You would always want to give something extra to your reporting clients or your managers or whoever. So whatever job you are in, you will naturally try to put in something extra to it. With the passage of time, I've seen that at least the HRs and the companies have grown really conscious about this work-life balance thing. So while I have stints of like 36 hours or 24 hours at a stretch during my audit and diligence days, I don't see that happening too often. What I have seen, in fact, with consultants also, now they are very, very clear when they take up the assignment that they would not prefer working on every Saturday or every Sunday. Once in a while, when the report is due, it's okay, but at least they take care of that aspect. So I don't think it's too much of a area which is worrisome. But if someone was looking to get into this kind of profile, they should not expect that they will not be working on any of the weekends, or there will be 9 to 5 kind of a job. Consultancy, anyways, it's a demanding job, beat any sort of consultancy.
Fair point. And so then you say that you put in a lot of effort. So does it also come like you get rewards also? Is the pay growth, designation growth, the path to director, partner very quick there?
Yeah. So obviously, I mean, from a pay point of view, possibly your starting salaries would be much higher than what you get in a normal industry scenario. I'm not talking about the Unilevers or the PNGs, but on an average basis, your starting pay scale will be really good. The bonus element could really vary a lot, and it can be really, really rewarding if it's a good year, you have performed really well, there are good revenues which the firm has generated, and of course, depending on the overall industry standard as well. As far as the path to promotion and partnership is concerned, typically, again, it takes 12 to 14 years to get to a partner level. But again, all these, companies who are into this diligence field, they also suffer from a problem of plenty. So, they also time and again keep on revising their organizational structure, wherein they will introduce levels in between and all. A partner, new partner would possibly now be named as an associate partner or something. So it all depends. But 12 to 15 years is what is an ideal path to come to a partnership level generally in these kind of job profiles.
Got it. Now you shifted then after a due diligence, very exciting assignment, you shifted to the industry side of the thing, your client side, as one would say. So Tata Steel. So then what was your trigger, like work-life balance, or when Tata Steel was offering a job in Calcutta, so you said, oh, hey, let me pack my bags and go and meet mom. So what was the trigger, and what was the difference between industry side of M&A and the other side?
So the trigger for me was, getting the flavor of a full M&A cycle. Due diligence is only a small part of an entire M&A transaction, right? Where a company identifies a target entity and went on to acquire it, due diligence is possibly, I would say, 1/5 or 1/6 of the entire, transaction cycle. And depending on, what is the objective of the acquiring company. the importance can increase or decrease. So I had always interest in the M&A space, and then I wanted to see the other bits and pieces of an M&A transaction life cycle as well. So that was the kind of trigger to move into a corporate M&A side, because in financial diligence practice, I would have never got that experience. Here in corporate M&A, the differentiating factors are you actually see why a particular company is being evaluated, the strategy behind that acquisition, the way the valuation is built up, how negotiations are happening. You get to see the legal side of it also, wherein you are kind of working with the lawyers to negotiate and finalize a document. So those were the key triggers for me to move into corporate M&A role. Work-life balance, of course, being one of the criteria.
All right. So how was it different then? You worked in Tata Steel, now you're working in Mahindra and Mahindra. So is financial modeling one major part? So we discussed that you were not doing financial modeling as part of due diligence, but here I think that would be your core KRA, to actually work on the numbers and suggest the valuation range. Did that skill you acquired on the work front? Did you acquire some courses or so? And then what are the other attributes of a successful mergers and acquisition professional, like networking, or is it tough negotiation? You look to be a very tough negotiator that way.
Oh, I wish. I hope my bosses think the same way. So yeah, see, valuation is, of course, without saying, one of the most important aspects for an M&A professional. You cannot be a M&A professional without doing valuation. I mean, I cannot speak as to how much important it is. It goes beyond saying. So that's one skill which you really need to have. And as I said earlier, for due diligence also, it's not that if you're not building the valuation models, you can completely ignore that aspect. You really need to know how valuation works. As regards picking up this skill is concerned, I mean, there are several books, you can go through all of them, but it is only the on-the-job training which will help you. And as much as you continue to work on Excel sheets and build those models by yourselves, discuss with various people as to what really you can do with those assumptions and play around those. That's how you kind of learn that trick. There are several tools available. There are online courses available. There are courses by you as well, which I found really helpful to at least understand the basics of how has to sail through Excel sheets to derive a basic financial model. But as I said, just going by those books or by tools will not help you. You really need to work on an Excel sheet in front of you, spend hours, spend nights on that model, and then only you can excel that skill. So yes, for someone who has to be in this space, you cannot ignore that aspect.
And what about those other aspects like share purchase agreements and term sheets and all? How does one learn that? See, we are not from LLB background. Then how do we learn that nitty-gritties?
See, every legal aspect has also a commercial aspect attached to it. And that's how I have, and that is one particular area about any M&A which excites me most. It's about finding the balance between a legal issue and how commercial or non-commercial that issue particularly is. It again will come with your experience only. The more you kind of read various contracts, the more you interact with lawyers, the more you sit in the negotiation meetings, you will keep acquiring those skills. But on the hindsight, in your mind, you have to always play that a particular issue which you are dealing with, whether is really that important or that less important, where you need to kind of spend too much time negotiating. So for example, wherein you are negotiating a particular representation or a particular, now I'm getting a bit technical here, I'm not sure how relevant it will be for the audience, but your lawyers will always advise you from a very, very legal angle, whether on a particular issue, what would be their legal stand, whether for a particular representation, whether they will point blank and tell you, see, from our point of view, we don't agree to this because we carry this raise. Now it's a commercial call. And then ultimately it's going to fall on the deal team only to ultimately decide on that issue, right? And there you have to kind of apply your experience and acumen that even if the risk actually devolves on the organization, is it more than the benefits which you are going to derive from that particular M&A deal, and whether it is worth taking that risk, and then you actually take a decision based on that, right? So your lawyers will always play a supporting role in any amended deal, but as a deal maker, you should be confident enough to kind of find the right balance between the legal advice and the commercial benefits or losses which can
Got it.
arise from that particular advice.
And
So you know, you always have to take a very practical approach to everything you do.
like a business owner. And is there a difference between a buy side transaction and a sell side transaction? So buying on behalf of Tata Steel or selling something on behalf of Tata Steel, does it make a difference?
It makes a difference because the whole you know, your glasses of looking at a particular deal changes, right? When you're buying a transaction company, you would always have a very conservative approach where you try to deep dive into every small issue and see how it will impact your particular company once that transaction is closed. While you are selling, you will always want to kind of paint a very rosy picture and convince the other side to kind of buy it. It's like how you operate in a shop, right? If you're the shop owner, you try to you know, sell your goods to the customer in any way possible, right? You'll do a hard sell on that. It's the same logic. But yes, one aspect which everyone should keep in mind is here, and something which I mentioned in the very beginning of the session was you cannot push it too much. Ultimately, you will have to weigh it against whether what you are selling is really ethical and in an integral manner. I mean, in an integrity way, whether it is justified or not. You cannot misquote and start selling, right? Because ultimately, your agreements will have enough provisions which, you know, if in future your statements are found untrue, they are going to come back and bite you. So you can do hard sell, but then keep those core values always intact.
And does this profile also give you a lot of visibility, like in M&M or in Tata Steel, to sit with the CXOs and present? So a typical accounting MIS profile at the age of 30, 35 might not really give you access to a group chairman or a group CFO. Is that one thing which is a very unique part of M&A?
That is of course, and that's why, you know, this profile draws so much of interest from so many people, and it has its charm. So you know, any acquisition transaction is something which is not in a day-to-day activity of any company, right? So that will be in the direct radar of the MDs and CFOs and the business leaders of that company who are driving that particular transaction. So you will always have to be on your foot, you know, with possibly you getting a call from the MD directly and asking as to what's happening on that particular transaction, where are we, what's going on. So you always have to manage that. It has its own pros and cons. While that gives you a great visibility, that also puts on a lot of responsibility on your shoulders, where you really can't make a mistake, because one mistake and you are, you know, people are perception driven, right? There will be a perception formed against you, and you really will have to always be on your up game. So yes, it gives you really good visibility, not only within your organization, but you know, from a networking point of view with various other parties involved in the deal as well, right? Because you will be in any deal dealing with 20, 30 different people from various organizations, from the consultants on your side to consultants on the other side to CXOs of the other side. And you know, if you are really good at your work, then feasibility is definitely not a question here.
But I have one complaint against a corporate M&A profile. It gives you as much pressure as an investment banking job would give, but the salary is the same as that MIS or an accounting professional draws.
So again, see, because from a corporate, you know, it depends on different corporates how they look at this department. From a corporate perspective, again, when they are looking at a M&A department, some may hire experts from outside, and there the salary differences could be there. However, there are organizations which prefer to groom internal people into a M&A professional, and they bring in people from various departments into this same department. And likewise, people from this department are moved into various roles. So, you know, they want to maintain that salary parity, which obviously as compared to investment banking profile usually doesn't work. But I mean, yeah, that's something which you have to kind of take in your stride and, you know, decide as to really what you do. It's very individualistic.
Yeah, you kind of feel very jealous when your colleague in the other department just says, bye-bye, Ankit, see you on Monday, and you know that you have to sit in office for the whole weekend till night 2 p.m. for the
So
same
that's
salary.
the price. That's the price you pay for your choices, I would say.
Yes, it's a price for the choices, for that visibility also to an extent. You get
That's
a larger perspective
see,
about.
see, you get a lot of you get a lot. See, I would again put it like this as to what an individual wants to do, right? I would probably not want to do the same accounting job every day. It for me that's a little mundane. I am not trying to undermine that job in any way. People who do it are really great in what they do. They understand the technicalities there very well. I mean, of course, in today's environment, they also have to deal with so much of dynamic situations wherein the accounting standards or the
Indies and all is
ways
changing.
of accounting, ways of auditing are changes every day, right? So they have their own challenges, but I would probably not do that. I am a person who would want to evaluate something new every day, because every day you have 2 or 3 new companies on your desktop to kind of look into, wherein you are updating the senior management as to what is looking interesting, not interesting, interacting directly with them, getting their perspective. So that for me, I would say to an extent compensate for the the salary part you were mentioning.
Yeah. And so in terms of the adrenaline rush, have transactions that you've closely worked upon finally crossed that signature on the dotted line kind of a milestone? Any such event? You worked in India, you worked in the UK. That would have been a great achievement, right?
So okay, that happens. If you would have looked at like 10 or 15 transactions, probably that will happen on one transaction. That's the kind of success rate with which usually happens or is there in a corporate setup. So a lot of times we do get bogged down as to yaar अरे इतना काम किया deal तो हुआ ही नहीं. But I don't think that's the kind of mindset you should approach this profile with. Uh, you should try and you know have some takeaways from every deal to whatever extent it has gone to from each deal, whether it's falling at the signing stage or it's falling at the due diligence stage really does not matter. Corporates also do understand, and your success rate is not judged on the on the number of deals you have closed or the number of deals you have signed, right? While yes, it has its own charm that finally you've closed one deal, you've signed one deal, but I don't think that's really the determining factor.
That's not a good metric. I also always keep explaining people that maybe once in a decade an organization is going to do $1 billion transaction.
Right. So
Tata
I'll give you an example.
In 2007.
Right. So I'll give you an example. In my Tata Steel, I was part of the 2 large deals. One of the deal, I mean, both the deals were signed and we were really excited, but none of it closed. So while it was a motivating factor, but then we went back and realized that even in the process of reaching up to the signing stage, there was so much of learning and so much of growth of the people who are working on the deal has happened, that the demotivating factor of not closing the deal really is a smaller aspect.
Absolutely. Your bosses might not be watching it, I pray that, but is there an exit option from corporate M&A into investment banking, private equity, VC and all? Do you get calls from that zone?
Not really. I don't think there is too much of active seeking which the investment bankers or a private equity guys does in a corporate M&A space. But again, it depends. If you really want to do that, I think you can proactively try and reach out to people in those areas. And I won't say that the chances are nil, right? Because there are quite a few people who have moved from a corporate M&A setup to on the advisory side or on the PE side as well. But yes, there won't be much too active seeking from their side. It is you who have to do it.
Actually, the challenge there is because the team size there is also very small. So PEs generally have like 10-12 people in the entire India team. So that is also one challenge.
True. So it will depend on how you build up your network, how you reach out to them, and then convince the other side on your skill sets. If you are able to do that, there is still a possibility.
Now, a lot of M&A has happened. Now, let's move to closing thoughts. Tell us about one mistake in your life which you would like to reverse back, or an advice that you would give to Ankit at the age of 20?
See, I think it's very important to be a little fearless and go and seek out or at least discuss with people as to what you want to do. Right? I feel I was not very proactive in doing that, and I mean, though I have somehow managed to crawl up to a stage where I am in my career, but I feel that if possibly I would have spent a little more time, and now you have means of doing that, right? You can just WhatsApp or call or seek time over email to those people, and people also do encourage that. I was not very proactive in doing that, to reaching out to several industry experts or M&A experts in my career, and really identify the things which I could have really done differently to be at a different space, slightly different space. So that's something which I'll advise youngsters to be, be a little fearless, unhesitant about. Uh, uh, there is no harm in going and seeking active advice from people you know, or even strangers who you really believe can help you. But go with a really focused mindset. Don't go with random thoughts and confuse the other side. I feel I was quite focused at that point in time, but some advice could possibly have really helped me at that stage.
Any bosses you would like to thank on this show?
Oh, sure, quite a few, and I will not like to name personally, because it's a public forum, and I would rather do that personally to
but the
each
acts
one
of
of them.
good deeds, I mean, in terms of the situations where bosses have really gone out of the way to help you grow in your career.
The way I look at it is, you have something to learn from everyone, whether it is a good boss or a bad boss. From a bad boss, you learn things which you really don't want to do in your life, and probably once you reach that stage with your juniors. And good bosses obviously give you insights as to how you can really help a person reach a stage by helping them, rather than kind of really rebuking them for every small mistake or whatever they do. So there are good and bad people in every organization. I fortunately have not come across too many bad people. My bosses have always been very kind to me. It also depends on the way I kind of deal with them. You have to really understand the psyche of the other person and kind of mold yourself into how you really want to approach those guys. Every person, no one would deliberately want to kind of do bad to them. There are people like that, but very few. I would suggest, in your choices, you have to be really wise. In your choice of words, in your choice of dealings with them, you have to be really wise. If you're and that brings me to a very important point. People aspect is really a very important aspect in a M&A deal, right? You really need to understand how a person is thinking, and if you're able to track that, I don't think you will face too much of problems with your bosses also.
Oh, yes, absolutely. And sometimes, when you are in meetings with CXOs, the first introduction session, that 5 minutes, that whether this deal is a time pass or they are actually very serious about it. And a lot of that you need to read beyond what people speak.
Correct.
Amazing. What do you do for fun and fitness? Do you spend time with
your
kids?
Fitness is a subject which I'm not very too much into, but yeah, I do try and spend few minutes in the morning to kind of at least basic stretching and exercise, which kind of keep me at least not sleeping during the day, especially in these COVID times. Coming to the fun part of it, yes. Now that I have a kid who is 16 months old, I try and spend as much time as possible with him. That's the kind of stress buster and possibly the best one. During leisure at times, though not getting too much time for it, but I used to kind of read a bit, something into fiction, some self-help
books. Which books have you read? Top 3 books?
Difficult to name, but I've been into quite a few self-help books. I was a big fan of Robin Sharma during my college days, and some of the learnings I still carry from.
The Monk Who Sold His Ferrari.
That was one of the boring books which I did not complete, but there are others from him. So yeah, those are some of the self-help books which I used to like a lot. Now I don't read too much of self-help books. I think there's a lot of gyan around it, and every 2 minutes video on YouTube can sail through those,
Absolutely.
motivation stroke. So yeah, that's about it.
Final thoughts.
Final thoughts for the audience, I would say, as I said, two things. Be honest with what you're doing. Have a plan in place. Identify 2, 3 career options quite early in your, life. Whether you are just starting your articleship or just starting course, identify 2, 3 options here wherein you really want to focus, because CA has a good number of options, and you cannot go behind all of those. So you have to identify your interest areas, shortlist 2, 3 of them, work towards them, work with all honesty, and don't compromise on your integrity, don't compromise on your honesty. You'll face many situations in your life, in your corporate life especially, where possibly you will be directly or indirectly asked to compromise on them, and then it becomes a choice whether you really want to do that or not. So approach it in a very pragmatic manner. Career growth aspirations are important, but you decide on your own how important those are.
Absolutely wonderful. I mean, it has been such an engrossing session. We really learned so much about transactions, due diligence, deals, financial modeling. Ankit, thank you so much for sparing time out of it. Maybe you would have been given an assignment even for the weekend. So M&A professionals really don't have a weekend per se, but you.
No, I hope that at least, even a few people could benefit from this. It will be worth all the time.
Yeah.
We don't get to do too many sessions as this and share, with a large audience and the kind of reach you have. I hope some people could benefit.
Yeah. So audience, if you've loved it, please like this. We're also going to launch it on Google Podcast, Apple iTunes, Spotify, etc. The audio part. So maybe you can listen to it while driving back to home or office. So thank you so much. Thanks, Ankit, for being on the show. Stay connected. Bye-bye.
Sure. Thanks, Anurag.